This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 27 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, July 2nd, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Patrons of the J.V. Fletcher Library are reminded that the building will be closed Sundays during July and August. Mrs. Clara and Ruth Fisher are enjoying a vacation at Plymouth. Mrs. A.W. Hartford attended the graduating exercises at the Melrose High School Tuesday, from which her niece, Miss Dora Hawkes, was graduated, being one of a large class. Mrs. J. Henry Colburn is spending a vacation at Alton Bay, New Hampshire. That's on Lake Winnipesaukee, I believe. The cake sale last week, Thursday afternoon, conducted by the ladies of the Unitarian Alliance, was a pleasant occasion socially and a success financially. There was a ready sale for the good homemade cake and pies, and some particularly good strawberries, ice cream, and cake on sale, and was especially acceptable on the warm afternoon. The sales tables were handsomely decorated with mountain laurel. Among our student young people home from vacation are Miss Gertrude Hamlin from Miss Kimball's Home School for Girls at Worcester, Miss May Day from Mount Holyoke College, and Alistair McDougall from Amherst Agricultural College. Miss Louise E. Crosby, who has been for so many years in the household of Mrs. Edward Prescott, for an extended vacation to her native Prince Edward Island. She expected to be gone a number of months, and Mrs. Alice Lambert takes her place at Mrs. Prescott's. The farmers are busy haying, which comes early this year. There is a good crop in prospect. Raspberry growers have begun to ship berries this week. The second game of lively baseball between the Colts and the Has-Beens took place on the Common on Monday night with a victory for the Has-Beens with a score of 10-3. Who knew they played baseball on Westford Common? Mrs. Oscar R. Spaulding has been enjoying life at camp this week. The next section is called Graduation. The graduating exercises of Westford Academy took place at the Town Hall Friday of last week at 10 a.m. There was an unusually small class this year, there being but 3 to receive diplomas, but a graduation is always of interest to the class, large or small, and parents and friends find a responsive enjoyment in the atmosphere. The bright, cool day was an enjoyable feature, and the decorations in the newly renovated town hall showed to excellent advantage. The front of the stage was banked with green potted plants and June roses. The class motto, Step by Step, in the class colors of garnet and gold, was effectively placed on the center of the stage and below the figures 1910, also in garnet and gold. The graduating class consisted of Miss Bertha Can McCoy, Albert Addison Talent, and Paul Edward Sims. The exercises were opened by a song, Clang of the Forge, by the school, followed by prayer by Reverend David Wallace. The first essay was by Albert Talent on the conquest of the air, and was a timely and thoughtful treatment on the subject of aeroplanes and all kinds of flying machines. Aeroplanes is spelled A-E-R-O-P-L-A-N-E-S. Quote, the American of Tomorrow, end quote, was the subject of Miss McCoy's essay, and her straightforward and direct presentation of this subject was most creditable to her and enjoyable to her hearers. The third essay was by Paul Sims on America, and was especially pertinent, well-written, and well-delivered. This number was interspersed with a chorus of girls' voices, nursery rhyme suite. The second part of the program consisted of a chorus called The Rosary. All the singing was excellent and reflected the greatest credit upon Miss Mary P. Raines, who is the instructor of music. The essays that were read were a common part of the graduation exercises back in Westford 100 years ago. After this came the address by Professor Marshall L. Perrin of the Boston University, who had for his subject certain American ideals. He was an especially good speaker and fully merited the appreciative attention that he received. In an easy, fluent, conversational way, he presented some very profound truths for both old and young. He tried to make clear that there were no reliances without genuine effort, and his point of the failure to realize that it was greater to be than to do was finally presented. His plea for the old-fashioned and necessary virtues of responsibility, humility, thrift, industry, and the right kind of individuality balanced the sensible warning against the rush against all odds for real comfort, luxury, and convenience. Altogether, Professor Perrin's address was a most wholesome and common-sense presentation for some time. The diplomas were then conferred by Reverend Mr. Bailey in his own impressive and helpful way, after which the last chorus, Old Folks at Home, was given. Mr. Bailey was the pastor of the First Parish Church Unitarian on the Common in Westford. The reception, dance, and reunion in the evening was a delightful affair, one of the nicest June parties ever held. There were many present, but not too many, for the comfort of the dancers. The Lynn Cadet Orchestra's music was much liked. The concert and reception was from 8 to 9, after which the Grand March, led by Principal and Mrs. William A. Woodward, was formed and the order of dances carried out. At intermission, caterer Fred A. Smith furnished ice cream and cake. The committee in charge of the reunion were Mrs. Harriet Sargent Hildreth, William R. Taylor, and Charles L. Hildreth. Among the guests of the evening were Miss Gertrude Bartlett, a former teacher, Mrs. G. E. Lawrence of Campobello, and Mrs. Ida Cummings Allen of Ayer. This is Principal William A. Woodward's last year at the Academy, he having resigned, and his resignation has been accepted by the Academy trustees and the school committee. Mr. Woodward has been at the head of the school for 2 years and succeeded Principal William A. Perkins. Mr. Woodward is a teacher of experience and ability and came here from Milford, New Hampshire. He has taken an interest in the athletic sports of the school, both in basketball and baseball. He and Mrs. Woodward have made many friends and take this with them where they go, the best wishes of the community. Next section is the About Town section. Albert E. Trull, Trull, and Miss Florence Jeffrey were married in the village church at West Chelmsford last Sunday evening by Reverend Frank D. Taylor of Arlington, a former minister of the church. As evidence of their popularity, the usual seating capacity of the church was inadequate, and settees reduced the amount of aisle space. The bridegroom will be remembered as one of the bright and good that added salt as a savor to the life of Westford Corner. Mrs. Clara Littlefield of Fitchburg has been visiting her sister, Miss Belle Walker, at the many-acre farm at the old homestead, which was at 148 Main Street. Amos Poley has never finished harvesting his winter wheat, wheat. He sold it nearly in liquid form to A.G. Boynton of Lowell. I guess by that it was going to be used to make spirits. That old broken-down crooked stone wall from the corner of the Lowell and Chamberlain Road to the remodeled farm mansion of the former Levi T. Fletcher Place, which is still is located at 120 Lowell Road, is being rebuilt with modern taste by command of that strongly aesthetic personality, Miss Ella Wright, the owner of this old Fletcher homestead. Unless arrangements fail to carry, as they have on several previous occasions, it is expected that Reverend P.H. Creasy of Groton will conduct the service at the Unitarian Church next Sunday in exchange with Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey. Among the also in the grandfather business by the sonship of Charles and Rose Adams Decatur is our Stony Brook citizen John H. Decatur. All the way from Roseville, California arrives the photograph. It has a strong Stony Brook look. The assessors have declared a dividend of $16 on 1,000, payable by the taxpayers to the collector on or before November 1st, or a fine of 6 cents on a dollar will be added to the original dividend. This, of course, is the real estate taxes. That's what's being referred to. The Finance Committee and the Committee of the Whole at the annual town meeting plan to keep down to $16.50 on 1,000, but new laws and new revisions of increased wealth on the part of the assessors made it necessary to declare a disappointment. I don't quite understand that because it says it's $16 instead of $16.50. That shouldn't be a disappointment. Just arrived by the Fall River line, a large engine for manufacturing purposes for Daniel H. Sheehan, and that contract with the state for 15 million yards of burlap will now begin to spread out. Eugene Fallen is ill at the home of his sister, Mrs. Parfit, on Main Street. Poison ivy seems to be doing lots for folks this year. The next section is entitled Wedding. On the afternoon of June 25th, a quiet home wedding took place at the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel L. Taylor when their eldest daughter, Martha, was married to George Howard Jr. The parlors were decorated with ferns, June roses, and beautiful pink laurel from the woodland hillside of the bride's home. Reverend David Wallace of the Congregational Church read the impressive ceremony in the presence of the immediate relatives. Perry Taylor Snow, the young nephew of the bride, was ring bearer. The bride is a graduate of Mount Holyoke College and was for a number of years professor of psychology at the Western College in Oxford, Ohio. Western was a women's college. In 1976, it became part of the adjacent Miami University of Ohio in Oxford, Ohio. The bridegroom has been connected with large farming interests in Bound Brook, New Jersey. The next section is called, or next paragraph is called Death. John C. Wyman died last week Friday at the home of his son, William N. Wyman, aged 75 years. The funeral took place last Sunday afternoon, and Reverend David Wallace conducted the service. Mrs. Homer M. Seavey, Mrs. David L. Grieg, and John Grieg sympathetically rendered 2 well-timed songs. He is survived by a widow, 2 sons, William N. Wyman of Westford and Frank Wyman of Tingsboro, and 2 daughters, Mrs. Nellie Davis of Norwich, Connecticut, and Mrs. John Brown of New Boston, New Hampshire. Burial was in Fairview Cemetery. Mr. Wyman was a native of Vassalboro, Maine, and had been a resident of Westford only about 2 years. A few months ago, he was kicked on the head by a glancing blow from a horse. This, with other complications, resulted in his death. The next section is the Forge Village section. The Lions defeated the Richmonds of Lowell in the Stony Brook League on Saturday afternoon on the home grounds before a large number of spectators, the score being 9-8. This, of course, is a baseball game. Charles Flanagan, flagman at the Crossing, has accepted a position with the Groton schoolboys at Camp Merriweather, Belgrade, Maine. His place at the Crossing has been taken by Matthew Elliott. This would be the crossing in the center of Forge Village, the railroad crossing. Miss Roxy Bennett of Worcester and Archie S. Bennett of the teaching staff of the Somerville High School are spending this week as the guests of Mrs. Harriet E. Randall. Charles Colburn of Providence, Rhode Island, is spending his vacation with relatives here. Mr. and Mrs. George H. Weaver are receiving the congratulations of their friends on the arrival of a son named George M. Weaver at their home Sunday morning, June 26th. Reverend Melville McLaughlin of Dorchester occupied the pulpit at St. Andrew's Mission last Sunday. Miss Marjorie Rose of Belmont is spending her vacation with her grandmother, Mrs. Elizabeth Splain. Mr. and Mrs. Dennis Downey and 3 children of Marlborough are guests of Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Hanley until after the 4th. Mrs. Lucretia Reed entertained her daughter, Mrs. George Reed, her granddaughter, Mrs. Gladys Goodchild, and her great-grandson, Randolph Reed, of Lowell last Wednesday at her home on Pleasant Street. One of the most enjoyable affairs held here for some time will be the Strawberry Festival and Social Dance, which will be held in Abbott Hall Saturday evening, July 2nd, under the auspices of the John Edwards Hose Company. Mrs. Philip Socha has returned home from the Lowell Hospital, where she underwent an operation the 1st of June. Miss Elizabeth Dufort and Mr. Lapointe of Leominster were guests Sunday of Mrs. M.A. Lowther. They will be entertained over the 4th by Miss Margaret Dorr at Lincoln Cottage on the shore of Forge Pond. The next section is the Graniteville section. Mr. and Mrs. F.W. Harris and family of Lowell were Sunday guests of Mr. Harris's mother and Miss Ethel at their home in this village. Beginning Sunday, July 3rd, and until further notice, there will be 2 masses celebrated in St. Catherine's Church, the first to commence at 8:45 and the second at 9:45. Mr. and Mrs. Timothy A. Riney of Camden, New Jersey, are visiting relatives in this village for a few days. Cameron Circle held their quarterly meeting in Healy's Hall on Tuesday evening. Business of importance was transacted and the election of officers as follows: Ellen F. Healy, Mary Stewart, Bridget Healy, Julia B. Wall, Lena Delarengo, Martha Doucette, Margaret McCarthy, Rebecca Leduc, Lena Healy, and Flora Stewart. The last section this week is entitled Baseball. The Graniteville Baseball Club visited Lowell on last Saturday when they crossed bats with the Crescents on the Chelmsford Street Playground, a place entirely inadequate for an up-to-date ball ground, and were defeated by a score of 5-4. Saturday afternoon, July 2nd, what promises to be the most interesting baseball game of the season will be played on the home grounds here when Graniteville will meet Westford for their first game in several seasons. Westford will present the strongest lineup available on quote, the hill, end quote, and the game promises to be a hot one from start to finish. Before the game, there will be a match 100-yard dash for the championship of the town between Ledwith of Graniteville and Hamlin of Westford. This is to be run off on Broadway Street near the post office. And that's the news in Westford for the week ending July 2nd, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.